In 8.1, we're going to do a short comparison of strings and lists. So here you can see in my program so far, I have a list called list1, and it has in the words in it, I love working with strings. And then we have a string, and you've used strings right from the first module, and this string just says, I love working with strings. They basically contain the same thing, and so we're going to print them both out to the screen, and when we do, you can see the difference between them. Here's our list right here. It's a list of words which could make up a sentence, and over here we have a string. Now we can iterate through strings just like we iterate through lists. So we could say for word in list1, this is one of those for each iterations. So for word in list1, print word. And if we were to run that, it would print out each word. And we'll run that in a moment. We could also say for letter in string 1, print letter. Now what I'm going to do is so that it doesn't print a new line every time, I'm going to put end equals quote quote, and that just means after you print out the word, don't go to the next line to print the next word, just for sake of space, end equals quote quote. And so if I run this again, whoops, so if I run it again, you can see right here, this one prints out right here, I love working with strings. No spaces or anything, because there's no spaces inside each of these items inside my list. It just prints an I, then love, then working, then with. And you can see it did that right here, right up to the period. And then it does the same thing with string 1, except it's printing each individual letter. And since space, you can see there's a space right there, since the space is one of the characters that is in this string, it prints the space as well. Okay, so it looks like there's nothing there, but there's actually a space here, 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 and here at each of those spots. So we don't have to use these for each iterations. We could also use an indexed iteration. See if you remember how to do that. We say we need some sort of index, so I will use an I. For I in range of the length of string 1, this is just like we do with lists. So for I in the range of length of string 1, what we want to do is we want to print out string 1 at the index I. So if I were to run that, you can see it prints an I, then a space, then an L, then an O, V, and E, all the way down till it gets to the end of my string, and then it stops. That's exactly how it works in lists as well. And of course we can use some sort of conditional statement in here. We could say if string I is not equal to a space, then print it out. So in other words, what we're going to do is we're going to only print out, so in other words, what we're going to do is we're only going to print out the letter as long as it's not a space. So if I were going to run that again, you can see it says I love working with strings, but there's no space, and we can put end equals quote quote, I love working with strings, no spaces. Okay, so just wanted to show you that we can have conditional statements as we're working through each individual letter of a string. And of course we don't have to go through the whole thing. We can just say print string 1 0. Like, let's actually print what's in the very first box, because remember, lists start at index 0. Strings also start at index 0. So this is string at index 0. It would be the I, and you can see when I run it, it prints out an I. And just like with lists, if we want to print the last thing, if you don't know how long the thing is, you can just put in a -1 here, and -1 prints out the last character. -2 prints out the second last character, which is this S right here. -3 prints out the G, and so on as you're working your way back through your string. Okay, but how are lists and strings different? They are actually different. So for example, we can say list1, what about changing out this word love to enjoy? And then we can print list1. Just so you can see what's in there. So we're going to print it before and after, actually. So you can see it was love, but now it's enjoy. So can we do the same thing with strings? Well, let's try it. So we can just change this to strings 1. So we'll just change this to string 1. And instead of I love working with strings, instead of having a space here, what if we put an underscore, for example? Let's throw an underscore right there, and then we'll print it out and see what happens. So when I run it, I actually get an error right here. And if I click on this exceptions, it gives me my error. It says string object does not support item assignment. And what that means is you cannot change different characters inside a string like you can inside a list. Remember, we very briefly looked at tuples. You can't assign values or items inside a tuple like you can in a list. Well, a string is a little bit more like a tuple in that way, in that it's called immutable. Strings are immutable. So this is the string, and you can't just set one of the characters like you can in a list. So what can you do with strings? Well, we can actually do some of the same things. So for example, if I want to look in my string for a certain character or something like that, we did that in lists, right? Well, we can do that in strings too. So for example, we could say print string 1.index w. And if you remember from lists, what that does is it looks through our string and it's looking for a w, and it's going to tell me what position the w is at. And you can see the w is right here. So it'll be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It should print out a 7. And first I'm going to change my typo. And now when I run it, you can see it prints out a 7 because w first appears at index 7. Well, that works just like it did with lists. It works perfectly well with strings. Another thing that we can do is we can add to a string. So we can say string 1 plus equals don't you. So don't you love working with strings? And if we were to add this on and then print it out, you see our string is now I love working with strings, don't you, because we added something onto the end of it, just like we added onto the end of our list. And we can also do some math with strings. Sounds kind of strange, but if we put print string 1 times 3, you can see right here, it's actually printed it out 3 times, and if I scroll over, there's the very end of it. So there you have it, a little introduction of how strings and lists are similar, but they're different in that strings are immutable. You can't change each of these characters individually like you can inside of a list. So in that way, they're different.